My name is Andrea Earle. Welcome to the Building Classroom Community Podcast. This is the show where we talk about all aspects of building community among the learners in your classroom so that every student feels welcome, safe, empowered, and heard. In part 2 of our conversation with Jeremiah Ruesch, Jeremiah shares how he builds community with the learners in his classroom. Let's jump right in. What are some things that you do in your classroom with your students, both with your middle schoolers and your adults, to help build community?
So that's a great question. I'm very intentional about that, and I still feel like this is an area where I'm learning and growing in, and I'm doing iterations every year to make it better, and every semester. So the first thing that I do is in my classroom, I give every kid a fist bump or an elbow bump or an air high five, right? Like most of my kids are bigger, so they don't want the full, sort of thing. And so I greet everyone at the class before the semesters begin. I send out something, and this is something that Howie Waugh does that I really loved, and so I kind of borrowed it from him and have modified it a little bit since. But the idea is it's kind of like an introductory, like hello kind of thing. And so it's a slide deck, and it's optional; it's not required. But I put a little picture of myself and my family, and then a little bit about who I am, or some of the hobbies I have, or whatever, and then encourage them to share something they feel comfortable sharing. It's completely optional. And then I even do things like, if your name is something that is challenging to pronounce, or if you have difficulties, you want to be called a certain way. As you know, my last name is something that's often mispronounced. So I'm very aware of how that can feel in different spaces and stuff like that. So if you have like a nickname that you want to be called, or so it's just an opportunity to kind of get to know each other. And then I also encourage, if you do this, leave a comment on someone else's question and observation, positive and skill appropriate. So I've really enjoyed doing that. And even though most of my kids have been with each other for quite a long time, right? They know each other pretty well. It's pretty interesting how no matter how well you know somebody, there's always something else that you can learn from them, right? Or learn about them. And so that's kind of what I do before the start of the year. And then once the school starts, every day I greet the kids. And so I stand by the door and I fist bump or whatever. And if a kid's like talking or on their phone as they come in and they don't see it, then I usually just tell it out loud, like, "Oh, okay, well, I'm going to put this up here for you." Or I'll just literally leave my hand out for them, and I'll go, "This is for them when they get to it." And then I will keep going with the other hand.
Oh, that's
and,
great.
and then usually the other kids are like, and so it becomes kind of like, and the funny thing is like some days, when you're transitioning or like you're kind of forgetting what, like they expect it, right? So they'll come in and they'll come in. And so it just gives that opportunity to kind of make that connection. And then my big goal is as I tell the kids, I want to remove myself as a necessary element for this community. I want to be a part of the community, but I don't want to be like the leader of the community, right? So I want it to be a collective. And so what does that mean and how does that interact? So in my lessons, I typically present a problem for all the kids to work on. And then I don't give a lot of instructions. I just let them work with their partner on the problem. If it's the first time that a new team has been is meeting, I usually do some sort of like get to know you activity first, right? Usually it's a model of, so it's usually like for a friend, for example, right? So I use a lot of the protocol vehicles as a way to kind of get kids to interact with each other, to introduce each other, and get to know each other. Also, using Peter Liljedahl's toolkit number one is my primary vehicle right now for building community, and then also for effective instruction. So kids get to know each other. I'm a big fan of groups of three, even before the research, but like that really just kind of hits it home. So I do groups of three, and sometimes if I have an odd number or whatever, I'll do a group of two and a group of two. Like the rest are threes. So then so I have some sort of task that they're just trying to work on with very little instruction. So I usually give them like 10 minutes to kind of dig through the problem after they've had their introductory piece, and then we go through, and then I'm walking around circulating, and then going through the idea, right, that students will present whatever work they've done. I have the class look at the work and tell the people who did the work, what the idea was. This is the Peter Liljedahl stuff, but it's how I feel like it's how we build community. So the authors get to hear what other people are understanding their work is saying. Then they get to add to what the authors or what the audience has said, right? And then it gives us a chance to have a moment to like reflect and then go back and then they do the task. And so we do the synthesis of coming together and going apart throughout the thing. And I rarely have to lecture on anything, even if it's a new material, right? And the idea is that we have Google, right? We have Dr. Google in the room, we have Dr. YouTube in the room. Like kids have these resources, and so I want to teach them how to use those resources. And now I've been really involving AI as a big component of like having them understand. Uh, and it really brings in, speaking of words, right? The words, they're really starting to learn the value of vocabulary words because of the word phrasing that you get results or you don't, or you get garbage or you don't, right? So like, um, that's really big, and it, just as a at the college level, it's really big about academic honesty, right? And academic, like citing your sources actually makes you more authoritative than like, oh, look at all this work I did on my own, right? Like you want to cite your sources and give credit where credit's due. So I'm okay with kids using any resource that they can find. I want to know how they're using it, why they're using it, like, where did they get it from, and then add it to the class. So I have a class resource list of things. So like kids can constantly go back to refer to and stuff like that, because why reinvent the wheel, right? um, Off topic to your question, but I feel like each of these elements add elements of the community, right? So for example, I have a kid who she didn't feel very comfortable with her mathematical skill set, right? It had been a while since she had done any kind of like heavier lifting, mathematically speaking, and so um, she was really nervous about getting in front of a group, and or turning in something and stuff like that. And so she and I had a conversation. I said, I'll never intentionally embarrass you. And if I ever do, please call me out on it, because that's never going to be my intention, right? And you can do it, on the sly, or you can do it, but just realize that if there's anything I'm going to ask you for just to present, I will tell you ahead of time and ask you for permission versus like, telling you, so to speak, kind of thing, right? Um, and so I think it's the intentionality of like recognizing that there's an expectation that you will present, there's this expectation that you will be put on the spot to prepare, but there's also the expectation that you will have grace in that time, and you can share the thing that you feel comfortable sharing, right? So that's I think are all important inclusive practices. And then I try to pull out things that like we did a an algorithmic mathematical interpretation of the word "riz" recently, and its connection to and so like part of the assignment was to come up with a new alliteration of "riz," because like you have like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like you have these different really funny kind of like inventive ways of doing that. And I said, you guys, in mathematics, for me, it's really two things, right? You have creativity, right? Mathematics is about doing mathematics. Actual mathematics is creativity, and it's collaboration, right? It's those two things. If you're not doing both of those, you're not really doing math in the way that I've defined it in this classroom, in our spaces. And so, a lone genius out in the world doesn't really exist. And so, especially in a modern world, right? Like that whole narrative, I really would like to see torn down. So it's really about like just the framing, and then the activities, and the ways that we interact with. I gave a midterm recently in a differential equations class where the big challenge problem was they're positioned as they have to save the world with a differential equation that can't be solved, right? So they have to figure out the goal is to figure out how can they design a team that can tackle the problem and simplify it, and figure out like how they can utilize the skills that they have with the teams that. And so I gave them portfolios, and I gave them like some resources. So these are the resources, these are the people that are on your team. How are you going to use your creativity and collaboration to create a solution to the problem? And so that was really the test, right? Um, so it's not just a thing. It's community is, every person has their different needs, and every person has their different um, wants. And you mentioned the story about like that question in your staff meeting about where did you go, right? For someone in that space may have been like, oh, that's a great question, right? Like I feel so inclusive, right? And for someone else it may feel like I didn't go anywhere, like and it may not have been like either or, right? And some of us would feel like, well, I can't go anywhere, right? Like what are you trying to tell me that implies about me, right? Like it can be So I think we just have to be mindful that it's not a thing. It's always like it's like with anything in life. It's more complicated than a single answer. But human beings like a single number to represent something, right? Or a single like uh, strategy that solves every problem. So
Right. We want a silver bullet, right? That
right,
just fix
yeah,
everything, make everything work. But I like what you said about the way we talk about math with our students, and the fact that you're teaching them those critical thinking skills. Because you're right, we can look up anything, Google anything. Now you can go to ChatGPT and get information, and the kids use photo math to solve the problem, right?
yeah,
But if they don't understand what the problem is that needs to be solved, then
mhm,
all the equations in the world aren't going to help them,
yeah,
right? And in the real world, no one's going to put an equation in front of you and say, solve this. But instead, you're going to look at your
right,
checkbook and you're going to say, this is not balancing. Why is this not working? How did I,
yeah,
and they
yeah.
need
That's a
to
good point.
understand the critical thinking behind the math. And
Hmm.
I think I tried to do that in my classroom as well.
Hmm.
Um, but a pro tip for teachers listening, if you ever want real world examples to share with your students, go to one of the generative AI tools and ask for real world examples on why we need to learn about parabolas in seventh grade or whatever. And you'll get
Yeah,
some really great examples that you can share with students, because sometimes we don't think of those. In many of our
mhm,
textbooks, the examples are very contrived. So it is hard to find those authentic experiences, right? That
mhm,
the kids can really relate to. But I also think that goes back to the way we talk about math
mhm,
overall. I mean, if my
yeah,
core teacher tells me I'm not a math person, I'm just, math may be difficult for you, or you didn't understand concepts, when you were younger, but it's we need an assets-based approach even to our own thinking about math. But I think if more people learned about it the way you're presenting it to your students, with the choice and the
mhm,
problem solving and the critical thinking skills, maybe we could shift some mindsets of adults as well, right?
yeah, yeah. I think that I hear that a lot, right? This idea that I'm not good at math or I don't like math or math this that. And my response to that usually is, well, math was probably done to you, right? You didn't actually do math, right? And what I mean by that is that it's often this set of like rules and steps that
Mm-hmm.
you're forced to memorize, and like it's more about how much can you remember or how
Yep.
much can you, right? Can you repeat things? And that is not mathematics, right? That's parroting.
Plug and
And
yeah.
so it's been a hard shift for my kids because I don't give them answers, and because I don't give them a series of steps, right? Um, and mathematical modeling, which is a big part of the framework, both the old and the new one. One of my favorite parts of the modeling process that doesn't get a lot of hype or a lot of press, but I think is one of the most important things we could do as teachers, starting from kindergarten all the way up, right? Especially with kindergartners, because they are so curious. We should be fostering that throughout. But this idea that, if you have a situation like balancing your checkbook, for example, that you brought up, right? Is if we were thinking about like modeling that as a mathematical equation, this idea of paying attention to, well, what will we need to measure, right? What variables do we need to pay attention to? What functions would that be that would measure that or would produce that? Like, and then we try to systematize it from that. But just to create a process of understanding how mathematics comes in this world and this understanding, I think is so would be so humans tend to love to create things, and we tend to thrive in a space where we're feel like we're producing a product that we enjoy, right? And so if we give kids that opportunity to produce and to be creative, uh, you're going to get a lot more interest and value in it, right? And especially if it's something of interest to them, right? Making it relevant to them. And what better author than to ask them, like, what's something that you are interested in? All right, now let's figure out how the math comes in, because everything has math in it.
Yeah.
So even if you have to kind of wiggle it into space, everything has math in it in some fashion. And so the goal is as a collective of you and them together as a partnership, like being able to create that space for you all, to talk about what mathematics is there, and how is it showing up, and what's important to measure, what's not important to measure, how do we make predictions and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. Just forgot what I was going to say.
Nope.
Oh, Yeah, no, so it's so true. And I like the way you said math was done to them. Because
Mhm.
I was one of those students. I loved math until algebra. And then it was
Right.
formulas, memorize, plug and play. I had no idea why anything was happening. I couldn't memorize those darn formulas. I would do a worksheet of 30 problems, get them all wrong. Had no idea why. It
Mhm.
wasn't until I was teaching elementary school, my principal coerced me into taking this math class for teachers. And all of a sudden we were completing the square, we were cutting up stuff, we were measuring circumference with yarn and deriving the formula for pi. And all of a sudden, all these ideas that were very abstract and made no sense to
Mhm.
me became clear. And I think maybe that's
Mhm.
part of why I switched over to becoming a math teacher, because I know that a lot of students struggle with memorize the formula and move on. But when you understand the concept, you don't have to memorize pi. If you know how it works, if you need to use it to find volume of a, coffee cup, you can do it, right? So,
I love that. Yeah,
and I think you're
absolutely.
right, the way you're talking to students about it is very important. I'm sure that a lot of your adult learners come in with that negative mindset about math,
Mhm.
because I'm sure it's not the first time they've encountered, a math class that they have to pass for whatever reason, you know. How do you address that with them? How do you help shift their mindset?
Mhm. Uh, so it's the ones that tend to dislike it the most are two students, right? The ones that are just there to get like through something, right? So they don't really want to necessarily learn. And then the other ones that don't like it tend to be, actually it's ironic, but they tend to be your top students, right? The students that are really good at the game of school,
Mm,
right? And why are they good at the game of school? Is because they follow the script to a T,
yeah.
right? They know that they take the notes, they do the problems, right? They do everything. And then if you have a bullet point list of have this, have this, have this, have this, have this, if you want full credit, right? They're just like, yep, 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 yep. And they turned it in. The problem with that is that there's usually not a lot of thinking involved. And so you're being good at the game of school doesn't mean you're good at learning, or doesn't mean that you're good at mathematics, right? And so um, in both situations, I find that first of all, it starts with relationships, just like with anything, right? So you have to build that, and you have to invest in each person. And that sounds like, oh my gosh, I have 160 kids. Like, how can I do that, right? Investing in individuals, right? We all have our different level of investment. Like I'm good with a fist bump and I'm done, right? Like leave me alone. But some people want to spend lunch with me, and they want to tell me their whole life story and that kind of thing. So understanding what individual needs are is the first thing, and then from there, for the high achievers, the kids that are really trying to get that grade, it's just a shift in what's expected of them, right? So it's just an explanation of you may have been up to this point having math done to you. Now you're going to do math, and so it's just a matter of shifting that, and then having them understand that. I preface it and just kind of call it out, right? The elephant in the room, so to speak. It's going to be challenging. You're going to have moments you're probably going to curse my name, right? Because it will be something that will be new for you. But I'll tell you that when you're done with this, you're going to be much better off. And in fact, I have a student right now who's very much like that, who is very, very much like everything's perfect, and she's very much like top student, very much like getting everything done. And I asked her quite recently, like, how is this for you? Because I knew that I've had some hard problems recently that she's going through. And she said that uh, she prefers the other one, right? She prefers having everything laid out for her, but she gets more reward and more excitement from this way, the way that I'm doing it, right? And she goes, it's more frustrating and it's more time consuming and it's more difficult, but when I'm done, it feels so good. And I said, that's kind of like how anything in life is, right? Like if you ask a big person who's a vegan, right? Like they're very open about it. Why? Because it's so hard to be a vegan, right? Like we live in a not very vegan in culture. Or if you talk to someone who works out a lot, like why are they always talking about it? Because it's very hard to stay that level of performance. And so I think anything in life worth doing is going to have that challenge, right? And math, you're right, is not an easy thing. It's both difficult to grasp, and it's also like if you're thinking about, in the typical K-12 world where we look at answers, right? One little mistake, a negative sign, a, adding two digits wrong, right? Mistaking my O for a zero or whatever, right? Like all of those things can end up getting an incomplete or a wrong answer, and like those things can be very challenging, and that's those little things about math that are not fun necessarily. But I don't know if I answered the question, but I hope that kind of.
No, you're right, because that does go back to that growth mindset and that productive struggle. But it's the way we present it to students. If we just, here's a hard problem, go do it. Right. You're going to get that affective filter is going to fly up and they're going to be tuned out. But when you say, no, I know this is hard and I know this is difficult, but I really want you to take your time and think about it. And I want you to talk to your team members about it. And I want you to use your resources. You're empowering them, right? Which will bleed over to other parts of their life. Very few jobs nowadays. You walk in, you're told what to do, you do it, and you leave.
Right.
There are a lot more jobs where you have to, problem solve and troubleshoot and, think creatively or work through problems, and so if we can start using language in our classrooms and be very intentional about it, that it's okay to struggle, it's okay to fail, right?
Yeah.
I like the failing is the first attempt in learning.
Yeah.
But it's building that culture, right? But we do have those students that want that grade. How many points? Am I missing points? What am I, So it does take a while to build that culture. And what we say to students really does make a difference.
That's a really good summary. Yeah. And I think, and on top of that, one of the things that has really stood out to me this year in particular is that a lot of students feel like some indicators that I feel like I'm getting to some point of success is a lot of kids are starting to say things like their favorite thing about the experience. I do reflective journals after every class, right? That's part of my optimistic closure. And usually my questions are about like a metacognitive process or something they've discovered about themselves, right? And a lot of, in fact, I think I just posted a couple. A lot of things that I'm starting to see from students tend to be things like, community really has been helpful or beneficial to, like, I know I'm not in this alone, or like, I didn't know how to do this problem, but like, the community of the class has been really helpful. And like, I feel safe to be able to share, like, did anyone else have a hard time with this, kind of thing. And so, and in fact, I think every class I have, except for one, have a group chat, right? So they have this, like, they're all like texting each other and like they're all like blah, blah, blah. So I'm not included in the chat, so I have no idea what they're saying.
What they're really talking about. But the fact that you've created a space where they're comfortable doing that, I mean, that's a win right there. And that they've created this opportunity to continue the conversations right outside of your four walls. That's fantastic. And I think that's a huge testament to what we want, right? What we aspire to as teachers. But it's hard for us,
Yeah.
As teachers, we have days and we have, that difficult student, right?
Right.
Pulling your hair out, your hair's turning gray, and but it's how we approach it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever worked in a school where, you go into the staff lounge and the teachers are all, oh, this student didn't do this and this student is horrible, this parent, and all the negativity that just makes it so toxic. It really affects everyone when you speak about students that way. And it's teachers that do that, it's not just in the lounge, right? It bleeds over into the classroom, and you can see, why aren't you working? Why, and that whole kind of mindset. How do you, I guess, we're talking about words matter. How do you deal with those negative teachers, right? Or the teachers that are talking negatively about students? Because we all have students that drive us nuts, but it's how we deal with them, and how we reframe the question, like we started, this interview with, that can make all the difference.
It's a great question. So my answer will really depend on what hat I'm wearing at the time, like what is my role in the situation, right, and what space I have. So if I'm in my like consulting role, right, as a representative of like an outside agency, so to speak, the
Mhm.
way that I'll approach that is very different than if I'm like it's my colleague, or if I'm in a space where I'm working as a coach, let's say, right? Like so it really depends. In previous versions of myself, like I didn't have the comfort to speak truth to power, and so I would typically listen to someone who would say, this, that, or the other, and try to disagree or say like, oh, but there's got to be some, like, and try and change the conversation into, an assets based one. But now that I'm getting maybe older or grouchier or whatever the case may be, or maybe I'm just more comfortable in understanding, like you said, words matter, and it does carry over into other aspects. And so I'm more abrupt. I tend to go one way or the other, very, very like, and so I'm trying to figure out how to say things in a way that can be received, because if I'm an a-hole, pardon the language, but if I'm an a-hole about it, right, they're not going to listen either, right? That's not going to change outcomes. And so I want to be a voice for advocates that aren't in the space that can, that need that voice, but also in a way that the message is heard and received, and not starting a conflict, but rather a partnership to remedy and to change the address. There's a school that I worked with where the language in the classroom and both in the classroom and especially in the teachers' lounge was, oh, these kids don't, right, these kids. Um, and I don't like words like high kids. I don't like words like low kids, right? They're kids. And a kid that maybe have challenges in, let's say, a math class is also the same kid who could probably, rock it at a play, right? Or can play five instruments in band, or knows like two languages, or, knows how to take care of maybe themselves and their parent who is having a hard time, right? Like, we don't know what areas these kids have genius in. And so I try to one call out the BS, if I can use that language, of negative asset or aspect perspective things. And like the story you shared with your colleague who was having an issue with one of her students, right? What if we can step back and walk in partnership with the teacher, and recognize and recognize that, as human beings, taking on that perspective of what is rational from their perspective, right? So how are they seeing the world, and understanding like, this is how I'm addressing this issue, right? Human beings, we tend to find blame easier than to recognize where our own weaknesses or our own locus of control is, right? And so I'm not there yet, but I'd like to get to the point where I can understand it from that perspective, right? And say, okay, I've had the privilege and the challenge of working with some very, very difficult teachers, with very negative viewpoints on students. And so those opportunities have taught me, in a very, it's kind of like, I use this analogy with some of my spirited coworkers, right? Like when we get together, it feels hard to have a conversation with some of my colleagues, right? Like, not because of like we're actually friends, we get along really well. It's because we have different ideas, and both ideas are valid. So it's polishing a pearl, right? It's creating that pressure of like, and so it's difficult, but the product we produce is way better than anything we would have done on our own. And so I have that in my mindset in dealing with perspectives, that are more challenging. I'm looking at, okay, where is it? So in fact, I have a teacher right now that I'm working with who's been teaching for a long, long time, and she has a very negative mindset, both about coaching, and so me working with her is very negative. On top of which, her approach to students, and so I've been looking at, but I also see that she still has some love for her kids, and so the angle I'm taking with her, and how I'm working with her, and as I'm offering, these are the situations, right? And then I'm reflecting back to her the work that she's doing. I'm saying, do you see this? Do you see how this could be confusing? Right? Do you see this? Do you see how this could be confusing? Not as an adversarial thing, but looking at the data and saying, like, do you see these situations? And then I'm also, I keep praising her, kind of like how your colleague was, right? I keep saying, like, in the lesson I observed, first of all, it's just a snapshot, so I don't know the whole story. So this is just a moment in time, and that's all I'm reporting about, right? But also, I saw here you were really trying to give the kids an opportunity. I really see that you love your kids, and you're trying to give them opportunities, right? Like, I really appreciate that. Can you tell me more about what your thoughts were here? How did that go when you did that? So it's pointing out the things that she's doing well, and then also helping her to understand that, when you give 50 steps in one slide, any kid who's looking at that is going to be like, right?
Yeah.
And then you're talking about things and pointing at things back and forth. And so I'm having a hard time tracking what the heck you're talking about, right? Like, I feel like I'm pretty good about reading math stuff. And I'm like, oh boy. So it's patience, it's approaching it not from a deficit perspective from the person or people or culture that has allowed that to happen. And then the biggest thing, if you actually want to evoke change or talk about change in a system, leadership sets the change, right? So if you don't have a leadership that is on board with that, then you have to understand that you're swimming against the stream, right? So you have to figure out, like, how can you wade in that water, so to speak.
But you're right about locus of control, right? We only, as a classroom teacher, I only had control over my classroom, right?
My space,
but I had control over my classroom. There were things I could do and things I couldn't do, right? But I could make choices that affected my students. I couldn't make choices for the class next door or the teacher down the hall, but I could make my own choices. And that's kind of empowering when you think about it, right? That
it is.
And you never know what choices you make or what you say to students, what might affect them later. Super funny. I did a training yesterday at one of our elementary schools, and a young lady came up to me and she said, "You know what? You were my 6th grade math teacher." And I'm like, "Oh, in 2000." I'm like, "Oh my God." It was just cool. Here she is doing her student teaching, getting her credential. And, I asked her what she remembered, and she said, "I totally remember. I remember what we did in class." And I'm like, "Well, what do you remember?" She says, "I remember that you believed in me." And I'm like, "Oh my God." And I never said, "I believe in you." Right. But I guess through my actions. And I'm like, wow, that she,
that's huge, right? Like, what a payoff.
That's what, 24 years ago. And I'm like,
oh my gosh.
Right. 20.
That's amazing.
It's just, so you never know what you say may spark a student to greatness or crush them, right? So
absolutely, it's a great power, right? And it sounds great. It's a cliche saying, but great power, great responsibility. But the truth of it is, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's the greatest job, and like, it doesn't get the respect in a societal sense that it deserved because of the power that you actually have, right? Like, you were a fundamentally important person in that young lady's life, and like, it's so great that you get to hear that, right? Like,
we don't hear it very often.
It gave me goosebumps, right? It gave me goosebumps. That was wonderful. But I think that shows, like, the integrity and the power of the position that you did and the job that you did, right? Even if you weren't intentional in your actions, like, those actions came across to the student, right? And so it's just, I think the biggest negative about our world that I see is that so oftentimes there's a TED talk, it's called Lollipop Moments. If you ever get a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. But the bottom line that he's talking about is that we so often think that power comes in, like, these big grand gestures, right? And his story will illustrate the point, but his idea is that you probably have someone in mind that was a huge impact on you, right? Someone who did something for you, or someone who was a huge inspiration for you, right? You probably have more than one person, right? We're a collection of stories, and we all impact each other. But my guess is you probably never told that person, right, what an impact they were on you. And so it's a small idea, but it's a big one, right? It's like how he kind of ends this talk. And I think that like that really every year I think about that. I think that is, and so it's been one of my goals as a growth as a human being, is to, when I get impacted by somebody, I try to make them aware of how and when they impacted me. Um, for that reason, right? And so I think that as teachers, like, you've had thousands of people that you've impacted, and like, imagine how bigger their egos would be if like all of them were to come back and like, we don't get paid well and we don't get a lot of respect, but like that's a form of payment that would keep every teacher, I think, in the business, especially in an era where we're seeing a lot of people getting burnt out and getting moving on. So anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Maybe let's challenge our audience. Think about someone think about a teacher who had a positive impact on you, and send them a note if they're still alive. Right. Mine was my middle school music teacher. I still see him occasionally. We exchange holiday cards, and
nice.
Yeah, I sent him a note a few years ago and thanked him for just being a positive role model in my life, and letting me hang out in the band room. I was a band geek, and just giving me a safe space just to hang out and be. And I think we all have these people, but words matter. Send a thank you note, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I love the challenge. That's wonderful. I think that if we all did that a little bit more, right, we'd all be in a better place, right? Because even among our colleagues, just sharing, like, man, I really appreciated that you shared that the other day, because like, I was feeling the same way, but I didn't want to voice it. Or, man, I really love how your perspective like changed my mindset on a student or whatever. Like, so many different things that could happen like that.
Appreciation and gratitude can go a long way, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And to supporting us, right, when we're struggling, when things are hard. Teaching is hard.
It is hard. Yeah, the system that we work under is designed to produce what it does, and that is often in opposition to what we as teachers want it to produce. Right? We want to produce citizens with creativity and collaboration skills and critical thinking skills. Right? The 4 C's and all this stuff, but it's designed to not produce that per se. So it's
So we have to work within our locus of control and make our classrooms right.
That's where we started from. Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave with about why words matter?
Yeah, I think your challenge kind of like sums it up, right? This idea that ideas, thoughts, emotions are really how we convey things through the power of words, right? That's how this idea of language is kind of what allows us to be, the dominant species on the planet, right? That the fact that we're able to communicate, the fact that we come together as a community, right? The fact that we have a social need for one another as a group. And I think if we could recognize that the words that we use, the words that we say, not only in the way that we communicate the words, but also in the tone, the impact, the timing, like all of those things, really make a huge impact on not only desired outcomes or expected outcomes, but also on relationships with people that you care about, and also the people that are in your charge as a teacher. So I think I would end on 2 things. Don't be afraid of how powerful it is to recognize that when you share your words with others, right? Like it gives the opportunity for someone else to recognize that they've had this powerful impact on you, but then also recognize that you have that powerful impact on others. So I would encourage you to do, like you're saying, to reach out to those that have had that, and then also in the classroom side, recognizing, like, I just, like with my blog post, it was just the phrasing of the word, and like the order of the words was basically how things changed, and the impact of like 2 very different outcomes, right? Like one, I'm still going like, like stressed out and everything, and the other one is
the one was confrontational, right?
Yeah,
you need to do this. That's kind of confrontational, whereas which one would you like is more open, is open-ended.
Yeah,
With that
but it still
choice.
communicates the expectation, right? And I think that the last thing I'll say about that is uh, in communicating expectations with words, it says a lot about what you think students are capable of doing. And so I would just challenge you as a teacher to ask yourself and reflect on, what words are you using and what implications or what expectations does that communicate to your students? So,
Well, thank you, Jeremiah. I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation.
yeah,
And
this was a great conversation.
I think it's an important thing that we keep in mind, because it can change the whole tone of our classroom, and really the trajectory of our careers, whether we're enjoying what we're doing or not, right?
Right,
Depending
right.
on how students work with react to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us at this episode of the Building Classroom Community Podcast. And just remember that teaching is a work in progress. What you say does make a difference. So let's work together to create classroom environments where our students feel welcome and heard. Thank you for joining us.